He drank tea with prime ministers, while secretly passing secrets to the enemy. He knew where the commandos would land before the operations even began. He crossed out names, and those people were never heard from again. 900 leaked documents? No, far more. And each one changed someone's fate. But he wasn't arrested. He wasn't exposed. He was nearly promoted. He deceived MI6, the CIA, and even his own family. And only near the end did he reveal who he had truly betrayed. Why did a man responsible for failed operations live peacefully into old age in Moscow? What did he know about Western leaders that remains classified to this day? And most disturbingly, was he really the only one? Or are people like him still inside the system? A story that shatters trust, and the darkest truths emerge only at the very end. Stay with us. This is just the beginning. Cambridge University, 1930s. Young Kim Philby walks through Trinity College, his mind already turning toward ideas that would reshape his life. The son of the famous explorer St. John Philby, Kim seemed destined for establishment success. Brilliant, charming, well-connected, he possessed every quality the British intelligence services valued. But something else was happening at Cambridge. A quiet revolution in the minds of privileged young men who looked at their world and found it wanting. Philby wasn't alone in his transformation. Around him, a circle of friends began to share dangerous ideas about the future of society, about the Soviet experiment, about where their loyalties truly lay. The fascinating thing about recruitment isn't the dramatic moment you might imagine. There was no clandestine meeting in a dark alley, no briefcase full of money. Instead, it was conversations, shared ideals, gradual alignment of purpose. By the time Kim Philby entered the world of intelligence work, he had already chosen his true allegiance. When the Spanish Civil War erupted, Philby went as a correspondent. But was he there to report on the conflict, or to learn the craft of deception? The man who would later fool the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world was practicing his art, learning to wear one face while serving another cause entirely. Picture this: the headquarters of the British Secret Intelligence Service, deep in the heart of London. Kim Philby doesn't just work there, he helps build it. After World War II, as the intelligence services restructured for the Cold War, Philby found himself in the perfect position. He wasn't observing the machine from the outside. He was one of its essential components. His colleagues saw a dedicated professional, someone who understood the Soviet threat better than almost anyone. Why wouldn't he? He spent his days analyzing Soviet intelligence methods, studying their techniques, learning their weaknesses. What his British colleagues didn't realize was that he was also studying them, memorizing their methods, their sources, their plans. The psychological strain must have been extraordinary. Imagine sitting in meetings where your colleagues discuss operations against your true employers. Imagine nodding agreement when they celebrate the capture of Soviet agents. Imagine writing reports that sound like brilliant analysis of Soviet capabilities while actually serving as intelligence assessments for Moscow. But here's what's truly remarkable. Philby didn't just survive in this environment. He thrived. His superiors praised his work. His colleagues trusted his judgment. He became the expert they turned to when they needed to understand Soviet intelligence. The hunter had become the hunted's greatest asset. Philby wasn't working alone. The Cambridge Five, Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, represented perhaps the most successful intelligence operation in modern history. But what made them so effective wasn't just their access to secrets. It was their ability to protect each other while maintaining their covers. When one member of the network faced suspicion, the others would rally around them. When Donald McLean came under investigation, it was Philby who helped orchestrate his escape. When Guy Burgess's behavior became erratic, threatening the entire operation, Philby provided guidance and cover. The network operated on a principle of compartmentalization, but also mutual support. Each member knew enough about the others to provide assistance without knowing so much that the capture of one would doom them all. It was tradecraft at its finest, executed by men who understood that their greatest strength lay not in their individual abilities, but in their collective commitment to their cause. Think about the intelligence flowing through this network. Military secrets, diplomatic plans, counterintelligence operations, all finding their way to Moscow through channels that the British and Americans never suspected. The Cambridge Five weren't just stealing secrets. They were providing the Soviet Union with a window into the strategic thinking of their opponents. In 1949, Kim Philby received what many would consider the assignment of a lifetime: Washington, D.C., as liaison between British intelligence and the newly formed CIA. For the British, it was a natural choice: send their most capable officer to help build the relationship with their American counterparts. For Moscow, it was an intelligence goldmine. Philby didn't just have access to British secrets anymore. He was now positioned to observe the birth of American intelligence operations, to understand how the CIA would approach the Cold War, to learn the methods and capabilities of both services. His Soviet handlers must have been astonished at the quality of intelligence now flowing their way. But Washington presented new challenges. The Americans were different from the British, more direct, less trusting of aristocratic charm. Philby had to adapt his approach, building relationships with men like James Jesus Angleton, who would later become the CIA's chief counterintelligence officer. The irony is almost too perfect. Angleton would spend decades hunting for Soviet penetration of American intelligence, never realizing that one of his closest professional relationships was with a Soviet agent. During his time in Washington, Philby provided information that may have changed the course of history. Details about Western intelligence operations, insights into American strategic thinking, advance warning of operations against Soviet interests, all flowing through one man who had convinced everyone that he was fighting the same enemy they were. By 1951, the network was beginning to fracture. The Americans had been working on something called the Venona Project, decrypting Soviet communications from the 1940s. Names were emerging from those transcripts, patterns that pointed toward penetration of Western intelligence services. Donald McLean was the first to come under serious suspicion. His position in the Foreign Office had given him access to exactly the kind of information that seemed to be reaching Moscow. But McLean had an advantage. He had Kim Philby watching over him, providing early warning when the investigation grew too close. The escape of Burgess and McLean in 1951 should have ended Philby's career. Two of his closest associates had fled to Moscow, revealing themselves as Soviet agents. Any reasonable counterintelligence investigation would have immediately focused on their associates. And it did. But Philby had spent years building a reputation as the most capable counterintelligence officer in the service. When the investigation turned to him, Philby didn't panic. He had been preparing for this moment for years. He submitted to interrogation, answered questions, provided explanations. His interviewers were looking for signs of deception, but they were facing a man who had been living a lie so completely that it had become his truth. The interrogation lasted for months. Britain's most skilled investigators, men who had broken German spies during the war, focused their expertise on Kim Philby. They were certain he was hiding something, but they couldn't prove it. And Philby, understanding that his survival depended on patience and consistency, played the long game. He didn't try to convince them of his innocence through passionate denials. Instead, he presented himself as a professional intelligence officer who understood why he was under suspicion, who cooperated fully with the investigation, who seemed genuinely committed to helping them understand how his associates had deceived him. In 1955, the pressure seemed to ease. The Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan made a statement in Parliament, saying there was no evidence that Philby had betrayed his country's interests. It was a public vindication, but it came at a cost. Philby's career in intelligence was effectively over. He would never again hold a position of trust within the British services. But Moscow hadn't abandoned him. If he couldn't serve as an intelligence officer, he could still serve as an agent. He moved to Beirut, ostensibly working as a journalist, but actually continuing his work for Soviet intelligence. The network that had protected him for so long was still functioning, still providing opportunities for service. Beirut, January 1963. Kim Philby had been living under a cloud of suspicion for over a decade, but he had adapted. He worked as a correspondent, maintained his cover, and continued serving Moscow. But the past was catching up with him. New evidence was emerging, connections that investigators hadn't seen before. The British were closing in, and this time, they weren't coming to interrogate him. They were coming to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. Confess everything, tell them about his work for the Soviets, and they would guarantee his safety. Refuse, and face the consequences. Philby understood the choice he faced. His old friend Nicholas Elliot arrived in Beirut, carrying the proposal from London. Elliot had known Philby for years, had worked with him, had trusted him. Now he was offering him a way out, a chance to save himself by destroying everyone he had protected. But Philby had been preparing for this moment since 1949. Moscow had contingency plans, escape routes, methods of extraction. On January 23, 1963, Kim Philby attended a dinner party at the home of British friends. He called home to say he would be late, spoke briefly with his wife, and then simply vanished. The escape had been planned meticulously. No dramatic chase, no shootout at the border. One moment Kim Philby was in Beirut, the next, he was gone. It would be months before Moscow confirmed what Western intelligence already suspected. Their most valuable asset had come home. The man who arrived in Moscow in 1963 was not the same confident intelligence officer who had walked the corridors of British intelligence for 2 decades. Kim Philby had achieved something unprecedented. He had served Soviet intelligence for over 30 years without detection. But success came with a price. Moscow welcomed him, but it was a different world from the one he had known. The Soviet Union he had served from afar was not the same as the Soviet Union he now had to live in. The ideals that had driven him to betray his country were harder to maintain when confronted with the reality of life under the system he had served. His Soviet handlers understood the psychological challenges he faced. They provided him with an apartment, a new identity, work that drew on his expertise. But they also understood that he was now their responsibility, a man who could never return to the life he had known, who would forever be dependent on their protection. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. Kim Philby, who had spent decades deceiving others, now found himself in a position where he had to trust completely in the honesty of his handlers. The man who had mastered every aspect of espionage except one: how to stop being a spy. What does it cost to live a lie for 30 years? Kim Philby had convinced himself that he was serving a higher cause, that his betrayal of friends and colleagues was justified by his commitment to a better world. But ideology is a cold comfort when you're facing the human cost of your choices. The people he had deceived weren't just abstract enemies. They were colleagues who had trusted him, friends who had confided in him, subordinates who had looked up to him. The operations he had compromised weren't just intelligence activities. They were missions that cost lives, careers, and dreams. In Moscow, safe from prosecution, but never free from the consequences of his actions, Philby had time to reflect on the path he had chosen. He wrote his memoirs, justifying his actions, explaining his motivations. But between the lines, you can sense the weight of what he had done, the recognition that his success had come at an enormous human cost. His former colleagues in British intelligence struggled with a different kind of burden. How had they been so thoroughly deceived? What did it say about their judgment, their professionalism, their ability to protect their country's secrets? The Kim Philby case became a wound that never fully healed, a reminder of the perfect betrayal. Kim Philby passed away in Moscow in 1988, having lived the last 25 years of his life in the country he had served from the shadows. His legacy is complex, a testament to the power of conviction, the art of deception, and the ultimate cost of choosing ideology over loyalty. Intelligence services around the world study the Philby case, not just to understand how he succeeded, but to recognize the signs they missed. How do you identify someone who has mastered the art of being exactly what you expect them to be? How do you protect against the perfect double agent? But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Kim Philby story is this: he was almost certainly not unique. The Cambridge Five were discovered because of specific circumstances, particular vulnerabilities in Soviet communications. How many others have there been? How many are there now? The man in the photograph on that Moscow desk achieved something that still haunts intelligence professionals. He proved that the greatest threat to any organization might be the person who seems most committed to its success. In the world of espionage, trust is both the most essential commodity and the most dangerous vulnerability. Kim Philby understood this better than anyone. He built his career on exploiting that trust, and in doing so, he changed the rules of the game forever. The question that remains is whether anyone else is playing by those same rules, waiting for the right moment to reveal that everything you believed about them was a carefully constructed lie. In the end, Kim Philby's greatest achievement wasn't the secrets he stole or the operations he compromised. It was proving that the most effective spy is the one who never appears to be spying at all. The true scale of Philby's betrayal only became clear decades after his escape. He was known for passing more than 900 British documents over to the NKVD and its successor, the KGB. But this was just the beginning. Intelligence experts now believe he may have compromised tens of thousands of classified documents throughout his career. Imagine the sheer volume of secrets flowing through one man's hands. Every operation brief, every agent list, every strategic assessment crossing his desk became potential intelligence for Moscow. The mathematical precision of his treachery is staggering. For 30 years, virtually everything the British and Americans planned in the intelligence sphere was known to the Soviets before it happened. But numbers tell only part of the story. Behind each compromised document were human lives. When Kim was appointed MI6's CIA and FBI liaison in Washington, D.C., the duplicity turned deadly. Kim betrayed an operation to send thousands of Albanians back into their homeland to overthrow the communist regime. Many of the Albanians died. The Albanian operation represents perhaps the most tragic example of Philby's betrayal. Western intelligence agencies had spent months recruiting Albanian exiles, training them, preparing them for a mission to liberate their homeland. These men believed they were embarking on a secret mission that could change their country's fate. Instead, they were walking into a trap orchestrated by the very man who had helped plan their mission. Living a double life for 3 decades required extraordinary compartmentalization, but it also took a devastating toll on Philby's personal relationships. His home became another theater of operations, where even his closest family members were unknowing participants in his deception. The strain showed most clearly during his Washington years. Burgess, who had been given a post as second secretary at the British Embassy, took up residence in the Philby family home and rapidly set about causing offense to all and sundry. Philby's wife resented him and disliked his presence. Having Guy Burgess as a house guest was like harboring a ticking time bomb. Burgess was brilliant, but completely undisciplined, a man whose personal behavior threatened to expose the entire network. J. Edgar Hoover complained that Burgess used British Embassy automobiles to avoid arrest when he cruised Washington in pursuit of homosexual encounters. For Philby, managing Burgess became a constant source of anxiety. Here was a man who shared his deepest secrets, who could destroy him with a single careless word, living in his home and scandalizing Washington society. The psychological pressure of maintaining his cover while managing such a volatile asset would have broken most men. But Philby endured, even as his marriage crumbled under the strain. Even in retirement, Kim Philby remained a consummate professional. In 1981, long after his escape to Moscow, he gave what can only be described as a masterclass in espionage to East German intelligence officers. Footage recovered decades later from the Stasi Records Agency shows Philby boasting about his tradecraft and recalling his 30 years in the enemy camp. This extraordinary recording provides a rare glimpse into the mind of a master spy. Philby wasn't just recounting his adventures. He was teaching the next generation of intelligence officers how to penetrate Western agencies. His lessons were practical, specific, and chillingly effective. Philby explains how he leveraged his education and upper-class contacts, Eton Public School, a degree from Cambridge University, to become Moscow's inside man. The class system that had made Britain great had also made it vulnerable. Philby understood that his accent, his mannerisms, his connections were not just social advantages. They were intelligence assets. The recording reveals a man who had no regrets about his choices. Even in his 70s, living in exile, Philby spoke with pride about his accomplishments. He had successfully penetrated the most secret organizations in the Western world, influenced policy at the highest levels, and helped shape the course of the Cold War. From his perspective, he had achieved everything he had set out to do. The final chapter of Philby's life, his quarter-century in Moscow, remained largely mysterious until his Russian widow, Rufina, published her memoir. She gives a simple account of their cloistered, privileged, but torpid existence. What emerges is a portrait of a man who had achieved his greatest ambition only to discover that victory could be its own form of prison. Depicted as honest, decent, and permanently devoted to communism, Kim remained an unreconstructed Brit. Even in Moscow, surrounded by the society he had served for 30 years, Philby could not fully shed his English identity. He maintained British habits, British tastes, British ways of thinking. The man who had betrayed everything British had become a walking contradiction. The Soviet Union treated him well, but not as well as he had expected. After his arrival in Moscow, Philby discovered that he was not a KGB colonel, as he'd been led to believe. Although he was paid comparatively well, his family weren't immediately granted the privileges he had been promised. He also worked as an occasional consultant to the KGB, helping to prepare spies for missions to the West. His expertise remained valuable, but he was no longer the active agent he had been. Instead, he became a teacher, passing on his knowledge to a new generation of Soviet intelligence officers. In 1988, Philby died of heart failure. He was given a hero's funeral and posthumously awarded numerous Soviet medals. The country he had served in secret for 30 years finally acknowledged him publicly. Soviet newspapers praised his contribution to the cause of socialism, describing him as one of the most successful intelligence officers in history. But even in death, Philby remained a controversial figure. His widow was ready to surrender the property to the USSR Foreign Intelligence Service in exchange for a generous pension, but received nothing and died in extreme poverty. A man who sacrificed everything for his ideals was unable to secure his wife's future. There were plans to turn his famous apartment, where the retired spy had trained Russian agents, into a museum. It would have been a fitting tribute to the man who had redefined the art of espionage. But bureaucracy and politics intervened, and the museum never materialized. The contrast is striking. In death, as in life, Kim Philby remained a man caught between two worlds, fully accepted by neither. The British could never forgive his betrayal, while the Soviets, despite their public honors, never fully trusted the man who had betrayed his own country. If he could betray Britain, what guarantee was there that he wouldn't betray them? The Kim Philby story continues to fascinate because it raises questions that have no easy answers. The government had intentionally conducted a campaign to keep Kim Philby's spying confidential to minimize political embarrassment. Even decades after his escape, the British government was still trying to manage the fallout from his betrayal. Top-secret MI5 files detailing first-hand accounts of confessions of three of Britain's most notorious double agents, including Kim Philby and Anthony Blunt, who spied for the Soviet Union, were released for the first time on Tuesday. These recent revelations, released only in 2025, show how the intelligence community is still grappling with the Philby legacy. The documents reveal new details about the extent of the damage caused by the Cambridge Five, but they also raise new questions. How many other agents were there? How many operations were compromised? How many lives were lost because of information that flowed through Cambridge-educated traitors? Intelligence professionals study the Philby case not just as history, but as a warning. The methods he used, the psychological techniques he employed, the way he built trust while simultaneously betraying it. These are timeless elements of espionage that remain relevant today. The most disturbing aspect of the Kim Philby story is how easily it could happen again. The vulnerabilities he exploited, trust, institutional loyalty, class privilege, still exist in modern intelligence organizations. The technology may have changed, but the human elements remain constant. Kim Philby proved that the greatest threat to any organization is not the external enemy, but the internal betrayer. Someone who understands the system so completely that they can manipulate it without detection. Someone who appears to be the perfect employee while actually serving the enemy's interests. In the end, Kim Philby's legacy is not just about one man's betrayal. It's about the eternal challenge of distinguishing between loyalty and treachery, between the person who serves the organization and the person who serves themselves. In a world where trust is essential but betrayal is always possible, the Kim Philby story remains as relevant today as it was 70 years ago. His greatest achievement was not the secrets he stole, or the operations he compromised. It was proving that the most dangerous spy is the one who never appears to be spying at all. And somewhere, in some intelligence agency, there may be another Kim Philby, perfectly positioned, completely trusted, and secretly serving the enemy. The question is not whether such people exist, but whether we will recognize them before it's too late.